Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hello and welcome to TV on TV. I'm State Representative Tommy Vitolo. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. Today is Thursday, June 13th, and we have a great show for you today. I've got Dennis Doughty, the chair of Brookline's advisory committee. In an interview recorded earlier this week, we discussed just what happened in the May town meeting several weeks ago. We looked at the contentious and the most interesting articles, and in a 25-minute interview, we'll cover it all for you. But first, as always, we begin with the news. President Joe Biden headed to Italy yesterday for a meeting with leaders of the G7. On the agenda, they'll discuss plans to dismantle frozen Russian assets in hopes of generating funds for the war in Ukraine. Aerospace corporation SpaceX completed the fourth full-scale test flight of its Starship vehicle this week. Working with NASA, SpaceX hopes to utilize this spacecraft in lunar landings this decade. Joey Chestnut has been barred from competing in Nathan's famous 4th of July hot dog eating contest this year. Chestnut has won the competition 16 times since 2007, eating a world record 76 hot dogs and buns in 10 minutes in 2021. Massachusetts recorded a 10% drop in opioid-related overdose deaths in 2023, the largest drop in 20 years. The state launched a first-in-the-nation effort to warn the public about so-called pregnancy crisis centers. The program, funded through the fiscal year 2024 budget, will direct the Department of Public Health to create a campaign to amplify how anti-abortion centers provide misinformation about abortion services. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported a sighting of more than 160 whales off the coasts of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket this week. This includes 93 sei whales, an endangered species. Brookline established a new sustainability division in the Department of Public Works. Directed by Alexandria Vecchio, this division will change the processes and departments in the town government as well as town buildings and vehicles. The town has launched a new housing case inquiry portal run by the Housing Sustainability Office to help residents with housing issues. The fourth annual Brookline Juneteenth celebration is this coming Wednesday, June 19. The Freedom March begins at 10 a.m. at the Florida Ruffin Ridley School, 345 Harvard Street, and will make its way to the Brookline Avenue Park and Playground located at 575 Brookline Avenue. The celebration will continue at the park from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. as people celebrate, eat, dance, play, shop, and more. Folks, that's the news for the week. Stay tuned on the flip side where I interview Dennis Doughty, chair of Brookline's advisory committee, about the town meeting that happened just a few weeks ago. Stay tuned. And we're back with advisory committee chair Dennis Doughty. As you know, town meeting was the end of May, and it's time for a recap. We've got Dennis Doughty, who essentially moderates the advisory committee conversation on every warrant article. Really not so much opinions, much more just the facts, ma'am. Dennis, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, great to be here.
We're going to start with the one that drew the most intensity and emotion and conversation before town meeting, but in fact drew the least intensity and emotion and conversation during town meeting. That's warrant article 19, a resolution to support a ceasefire in Gaza. Dennis, what ultimately happened with that?
Well, what happened was that town meeting voted to table the discussion indefinitely. And that was the result, in my opinion, at least, of a fundamental problem with engaging in that kind of debate, because it's a very, very tough issue. It's affected deeply members of Brookline who have relatives in the region, and either in Gaza or in Israel proper. It was a very, very painful and poignant debate for a number of people, and it was very hard, I think, during the run up to reach any kind of fundamental agreement on a resolution that could be embraced by everyone, because so many of the so much of the history and so much of the terminology that's involved has been sort of deeply and hotly debated. In the run-up, the advisory committee held a very well-attended, very lengthy discussion in which people who have interests on all sides of this issue got a chance to speak. And from the advisories committee's perspective, that was an incredibly important and valuable discussion that we didn't think we could add anything to. And so our ultimate recommendation was to make no recommendation, but to simply bring it to town meeting. And then ultimately town meeting decided that both the conversation itself had been powerful, and that the fact that there was going to be likely to be a professionally mediated community discussion coming up sometime later this month or sometime in July could serve as a better expression of the community's wishes than having a debate or having a vote taken at town meeting.
And just for a little bit of context before we move on, the vote to table is a vote that folks have not seen in, I'm hearing at least 30 years. It's simply not something that was typically done. And it's worth noting that that vote to table, which requires a 2/3 supermajority, happens before any debate. And so literally we got to warrant Article 19 Thursday evening. The moderator said, we're moving on to warrant Article 19. There is a motion to table, and we voted, town meeting voted to table, and that was it. We were done.
Yeah, and that's true. It does overlook or elide a little bit the fact that there was an extensive debate on the merits of the motion to table on the town meeting members association email thread. So I don't think anybody came to the discussion not understanding the consequences of that vote, or why people would vote one way or the other.
That's right. It turns out that elected officials have conversations with peers, with colleagues over email and other ways leading up to, and that's not dissimilar from what happens at the State House, as you might imagine. I want to move on. We've got a lot to cover. Not many of the articles ultimately proved to be close votes, but there was some substance there and some room for conversation. I kind of want to go back to the beginning to special town meeting 1 and 2. Let's start with special town meeting 1, which was an Article 97 home rule petition related to geothermal heating and cooling Pierce School in the Pierce playground across the street. There's a lot there to unpack, and it's not obvious why this should be such a big deal, but in fact it is. Can you run us through it at least a little bit and give us some sense?
Sure. I mean, so Article 97 is basically the part of the state constitution that controls the disposition of property that has been used for a public purpose, such as a park or a playground or the like. And so, if you're ever going to change the distribution of a property, it has to go through a process of community involvement, and typically another property has to be identified to replace the use if it's been taken. And there's a legitimate debate in this particular playground as to whether or not the land of the playground is being that the geothermal wells are going to be placed underneath is being repurposed. The playground is going to be out of service for a period of time, a year, in order to install the geothermal wells. And secondly, the land that's underneath the playground is going to be now converted into geothermal, so it can't be used for other purposes. And one of the concerns that the community had expressed is whether or not things such as its use for tree roots or its use for potential other purposes, which could include a pool or some other purpose that might happen on that playground, was properly adjudicated through the Article 97 process. The town's position has been that the land wasn't likely to be used for any other purpose. If it would be used for a pool or something like that, you would have to go through an additional Article 97 process, and that as far as trees are concerned, the town arborist, Tom Brady, made it very clear that there should be no impact on the ability to plant additional shade trees in the future on that space, even if the wells are underneath. And so the town's position is that essentially the only real change in use is that there's going to be a new access panel in the middle of the sidewalk, in the middle of the playground, that would provide access for maintenance purposes for the wells. All of this was discussed at town meeting. Ultimately, although I can't tell you the eventual vote. It passed overwhelmingly, and so there's just a home rule petition asking for the ability to use this property for geothermal to heating and cooling for the Pierce School.
Yeah, and so it passed with 91% of the vote, as it turns out. And that is relevant to me because I now have to carry that through the legislature, and that it passed with 91%. That much support is helpful. The reason why we did a special town meeting instead of doing it amongst the other articles in the full town meeting was precisely so that the document could be passed on to the state legislature as quickly as possible, because it has to pass both the House and Senate by July 31, which is quick time in legislative cycles. So we'll see how that proceeds in the legislature. The other special town meeting was to remove the police from civil service. Almost no controversy, very little debate, but still meaningful and worth talking about, I think, on this forum.
Right. And one other thing about special town meeting one, a lot of the debate about the Article 97 process is these processes exist for a really important reason, to make sure that the community has the opportunity to weigh in when changes are made. And so I think that it is, it passed overwhelmingly, and the objections, I think, or the concerns were legitimate, and I'm glad that those issues were raised. When it comes to the removing the police from civil service, the civil service protections were adopted during a period in which the primary concern, at the time at least, was nepotism in hiring. A lot of concerns that were important in the 60s and 70s, but are far less relevant to the police force of today. And those protections actually kind of paradoxically made it hard for the police department to hire new employees, to promote effectively, to in other words, to do merit-based promotions and the like. And it has been something the town has cared about for some time. And the department, in a lot of ways, the police chief has argued that it would be much easier for the town for the police department to hire, promote, and compensate effectively if we were able to eliminate the adoption of the civil service requirements. This was something that was successfully negotiated with the police union during the most recent police budget collective bargaining discussions. I think to the satisfaction of all sides. I know the town is very happy to be moving forward with a police contract that is forward-looking rather than retrospective. This is the first time in quite some time that we have an active police contract that looks forward for several years. And I believe that the removal of the police from civil service protection is something that everyone is happy with on all sides of these collective bargaining negotiations.
And I should add, we also passed warrant Article 2, which was the police collective bargaining contract. And we did warrant Article 17, which is a home rule to allow recently retired police officers to work details under certain circumstances with all of their certifications up to date, which is, in fact, a future benefit for current police employees. So the police got a lot of attention, made a lot of progress without a whole lot of debate. I don't want to spend too much time on it, though, because there's some other interesting things that I do want to make sure we get to. The Maytown meeting, first and foremost, is about the budget, right? And in this case, that was Article 10. And the budget gets bigger and bigger every year as our costs grow. Employment, wages being the biggest one. Uh, Overall, how do you feel? Well, we'll get to the amendment in a second, but how do you feel like it went? Do you feel like it was a good budget? You feel like we're moving forward?
Right. So I think that the budget process starts in the fall and continues right up until town meeting. And part of the committee that I chair, the advisory committee's role is to review the departmental budgets each year, and with them from the perspective, basically from two perspectives. One, what are the goals of each department? And two, does the budget allocation that each department gets service those goals effectively? And over the past few years, the advisory committee has had a focus on a couple of longstanding concerns that, in our opinion, the budgets had not been adequately addressing. And most of those revolve around long-term planning and maintenance. So this means we've built a lot of buildings over the last few years. Are we adequately adding to the budget the increased maintenance cost associated with having new buildings? Have we been deferring too much maintenance? In our opinion, over the past few years, on the school side of the ledger, school buildings have not been getting sufficient maintenance. And I'm very happy to report that this year's budget included significant increases over the past few years in terms of building maintenance. And we were able to add noticeable funds to some of our vulnerable populations, particularly the Council on Aging got an increase from prior years, and Veteran Services got an increase as well. The other area that I think, and I know you're going to get to this when we get to talk about the Community Preservation Act, is a renewed focus on long-term capital planning. We were lucky enough this year to have extra funds that we could allocate to backlog of street repairs and the like. So that's really nice, but that's one-time funding that we could add to that purpose. And over the long term, our priority over the next year is to make sure that there is a well understood, vetted long-term capital plan that the community can get behind.
Now, when we passed the operating override, it did include additional money for street maintenance, and it's still probably not enough according to civil engineers. So there will be more work to be done there. There was, as you know, a late breaking on time, but just barely, amendment of $1 million filed by Bob Miller, town meeting member precinct 2 and former Brookline educator. What was the scoop? Where did that come from? And what was the problem he was trying to solve?
So we have to back up a little bit. So this was a budget amendment to add approximately $1 million additional to the school department's budget. Now, without going into a lot of detail, there is a committee that's called the Town School Partnership that is responsible for meeting and allocating a budget for the schools. The budget is roughly 60% of the total budget. So this year it was $138 million. And that budget was lower than the school committee would like to be able to spend on all of its initiatives. In parallel, the schools have been doing an ongoing audit of a number of services, and one of the services that the schools have decided is not getting value for the investment was the so-called K-5 World Language Program. I might not get the details exactly right, but basically the assessment that the schools have done says that there's no difference in outcomes at the high school level for students who start the World Language Program in kindergarten versus schools who start studying languages in 6th or 7th grade. And so this year's school budget, or at least the plan for the schools, was to cut the World Language Program for K-5. And so the Miller Amendment was intended to add funds to the school's budget with the intention of restoring that K-5 world language program. Now, in our estimation, the advisory committee's estimation, and I believe in town meeting's ultimate estimation, there were a number of problems with this particular proposal. Number one, town meeting can't actually control how the schools spend their budget. They can only allocate a lump sum that the school committee will ultimately choose to invest in services as they see fit. And the school committee did not see the K-5 world language program as a suitable investment of $1 million. Number two, such an addition at the last minute was going to leave our budget out of balance by $1 million. This is a real problem. We have to have a balanced budget. We don't know where those funds are necessarily going to come from. And while it's possible that by the time the fall rolled around, we would have identified additional revenue sources or additional spending, because there's no guarantee of that. And we actually had a problem with a much smaller out of balance budget a year or so ago for sidewalk repairs. This was going to be a much larger budget busting change. And then thirdly, was just primarily procedural. You talked about this being a legitimately filed amendment, and it was, but it was filed at literally the 11th hour. And so there was very little opportunity for town meeting or any of the appropriate committees to really vet it and be able to weigh in on it effectively. And ultimately, it failed as an amendment at town meeting.
And there could be, in my view, there could be an 11th hour amendment for $1 million that isn't last minute, right? The language could come late if the conversation starts earlier. My understanding is in this case that didn't happen, and really the sixth floor of town hall, the bean counters and the advisory committee didn't have any inclination that this was coming.
That's right, because we had reviewed the school. The school budget being the largest budget gets significant attention during the run-up and during budget season. There are several hearings at the subcommittee in which the preliminary budget is presented, in which revisions to the budget is presented. It was well known that the K-5 world language program was not part of that budget and was not going to be for months in the run-up to town meeting. There was never any serious discussion during the debates, at least in our subcommittee hearings. I can't speak for the select board. In our subcommittee or full advisory committee hearings about any changes to that. And then the amendment came and during a period when we were going to not be able to hold any real public debate on the matter.
So it did fail. The budget as a whole, of course, did pass. And that brings us to warrant Article 11, the Community Preservation Act. Now, voters may recall a few years ago at the ballot box, the town voted to voluntarily increase our property tax by 1 percentage point on your total bill. And that goes into what's called the Community Preservation Act Fund. It is town money. The state, from time to time, does a little bit of matching. And that money must be used on 3 things. And the details are really important. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but you can use it on historic preservation. You can use it on public housing, and you can use it on parks and open space. You can't use it for maintenance in general. It has to be for investing in the community one way or another. And a minimum of 10% goes to each over the length of time, but not necessarily in any given year. The remaining 70% can go to any of them. And this was the first year that CPA expenditures were brought to town meeting. It took a while to get things ramped up and to collect that money. And so there was a long list of projects. Tell us about them a little bit.
Right. So, we had collected in the fund as a result of that voluntary increase in taxes, maybe about $9 million had accumulated. And this was an attempt to distribute about $7 million worth of funds. I should say that warrant Article 11 had 2 procedural components, which are basically to make sure that the funds raised in fiscal year 25 are allocated to those categories as you described, and to make sure that funds were available for the administrative costs associated with the CPA process. But the big question was, how are we going to spend the money? And so there were a number of proposals ranging from things like repairing the windows at the devotion house, to doing some repairs at Lars Anderson Park, to a recommendation to repair to contribute to the repair of a roof of a church building on Beacon Street, significant public housing support for some of the public housing developments and the like. And I would say that the majority of those items were not particularly controversial. There were a couple of items that raised some concern. So one of the items that had raised concern was the one I mentioned earlier, having to do with contributing to the repairs of a church roof. There were some who had the concern that this would be the one place where funds were going to be allocated from, this tax override to be spent for the maintenance of a private institution's building. And so the public, some members of the public and some members of various committees thought, from the separation perspective, perhaps funds should not be spent on a private entity. Another item that had raised some concern had to do with, from a housing support perspective, there were some concerns about the financial viability of the nonprofit that is going to end up helping to distribute some of those funds. And then finally, there were members of the community who expressed concern about the relative expenditures on those three categories, that less was being spent on preservation than on the other two categories. And so there was an amendment. I think,
well, in fact, there was very little spent on parks and open space either. The vast majority was housing.
Right. And so there was an amendment. I think you're intimately familiar with it. That was proposed to allow town meeting to vote each of those items independently, in part because there may have been the possibility that one or more of the items might not have received enough support to fund it, but also because having independent votes might allow future CPA investments to have a better sense of what the community's relative priorities are across those three items. That amendment got support, but not enough support to pass. And so ultimately the CPA was voted up or down in an omnibus fashion rather than on an individual item fashion.
Yeah,
and it passed.
Strictly speaking, it was a motion, not an amendment, but that's in the weeds.
My bad.
But that's right. It it did not get the support. CPA expenditures passed overwhelmingly. The largest expenditure I would note was for the Brookline Housing Authority, where they're essentially building brand new public housing at the cost for the CPA budget of about 40 grand a unit, plus another 40 grand a unit from the Housing Trust Fund. And so the town is getting brand new public housing units to a town budgetary cost of only about $76,000 per unit, which is remarkably efficient investment. And I think that the largest investment was such an obviously strong project, certainly helped everyone move forward on that. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to get into ADUs, accessory dwelling units, or mother-in-law apartments. The town did vote to allow people to build ADUs in their owner-occupied homes by rights, subject to certain size requirements for single-family homes. It looks likely that the state legislature will require even more permissive zoning out of municipalities. And so we may revisit that in town meeting coming up, but that was certainly positive news for those who want their mother-in-law to live in the same single-family house as they do. Dennis, thank you so much for coming on the show. Town meeting is at least 10 hours. The run-up is thousands of hours of volunteerism, which you are intimately familiar with. But thanks for taking 25 minutes to be on TV here on Brookline Interactive Group.